Well, good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Thanks for joining me this morning. We're in Genesis chapter 41 in the life of Joseph. Come join us as we look at it together. Today we're going to watch Joseph as he interprets or gives God's interpretation to Pharaoh's dream. And while we're getting there, I'm reminding you that doing a lot of the more personal things on social media networks, but for our YouTube and Rumble videos, we're instead going straight to the words. So if you're using these for intros, discussion starters in your small group, your life group, then it's very appropriate to go straight into what we're talking about and to the scripture. That way, if it's a year, 2 years down the road, you're not hearing about events that necessarily are out of date. So, as we're in Genesis chapter 41, we're going straight into the life of Joseph this morning. And we left him yesterday having been informed that Pharaoh wants to see him. I know you've been just hanging out here. It's been 2 years since you interpreted a dream for the cupbearer of Pharaoh. But guess what? He had a little revelation, and all of a sudden you're on your way to Pharaoh's court. What a shock it must have been. Joseph's reaction when we left him yesterday was in verse 15. Or rather in verse 14, when Pharaoh sent for Joseph, it says he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. So that's where we left him yesterday. I want to read to you kind of as an introduction some of what Chuck Swindoll says about these circumstances. He said, when Pharaoh heard there was someone around who could tell him what his troubling dream meant, he naturally said, "Go get the man." Now remember, Joseph knew nothing of what had been taking place in Pharaoh's palace, had no idea what was coming. He was back there in the dungeon when suddenly the chains clanked and the bars moved and the ropes lifted, and he found himself pulled up out of the pit. There's an interesting sidelight here that you've got to think about. When Pharaoh sent for Joseph, the guards quickly got him out, but instead of rushing into Pharaoh's presence, Joseph, it says, shaved himself, changed his clothes before he went up to Pharaoh. Joseph prepared to meet the king. Now, after all this time in prison, Joseph, of course, was disheveled and tattered and no doubt heavily bearded. Normally, the Egyptians were clean shaven. He must have thought, if I'm going to appear before the king, I've got to do something about the way I look. My appearance must be appropriate if I'm ever to enter his presence. So it says he shaved, he washed, he changed his clothes. Now, I'm not sure what Joseph might have looked like or smelled like after all that time in jail, but isn't it appropriate that he decided he would make himself look a little bit better before standing before the king? A little bit of decorum, just something else about Joseph that you can tell all this time in prison has not taken away his sensibilities, but if anything, grown them. Listen as Swindoll goes on. He said, pause and imagine this long-awaited moment. If it had been years since Joseph had been a part of the real world, then consider this startling contrast from the dungeon to the palace. What a rush. There he stood, freshly shaven, wearing a clean robe, and the Lord was still with him. We can see this in his response to Pharaoh. Look what happens next. It says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. I've heard about you. When you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Now, according to my sources, says Pharaoh, you're the guy. You're the guy with the answers. Tell me what my dream means, and I'll make it worth your while. Wait a minute, though, Joseph said. I don't have the answers, but God does. Talk about humility. Right here in the NIV, the 84 NIV, it says, I cannot do it. I cannot do it, Joseph says, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Talk about integrity. This was Joseph's moment in court, his golden opportunity to say, do you realize that I could have been out of the place 2 years ago if that dummy standing right over there hadn't forgotten about me? Do you realize I could have been handling dreams for you in these past 2 years? I could have saved you a lot of sleep, a lot of lost sleep. So if you expect me to help you now, how about getting rid of him and making things right with me, huh? No, there was none of that. None of that from Joseph. Instead, Joseph said, no, I'm not the one with the answers, but I know who does have the answers, and it's God. He said, in effect, Pharaoh, there's God up there behind those stars that your soothsayers are always gazing at but have no relation with. And I'm here to tell you, he and he alone is the one who handles dreams. When that happens, he says literally, God will give Pharaoh peace. Now, isn't that great? Pharaoh, God will bring shalom to you. He will give you a peaceful answer, and if it's from God, it'll be right. Now, you know why Joseph could be so humble and speak so openly? Because, now hear this, this is the important part of the message that we want to grasp before we see what happens with Joseph before Pharaoh. He says, because Joseph's heart had been broken, because he had been literally tried by the fire of affliction. Because while his external circumstances seemed almost unbearable during those years, his internal condition had been turned into pure gold. We are now witnessing the benefits of enduring affliction with one's eyes on God. Throughout the rest of Joseph's life, from age 30 to 110 when he died, we will hear not one word of resentment from his heart or from his lips. Not a word of blame against the brothers who sold him into slavery, not a word of bitterness against Potiphar's wife, not a word of rebuke against the cupbearer who had forgotten him. Joseph was eventually in a position to get even with all of them, but he didn't. Now, we'll see more of that later in his life, but for right now, let's look at how God uses him amazingly in front of Pharaoh. It says in Verse 17, Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river there came up these 7 cows, fat and sleek. They grazed among the weeds, and after that 7 other cows came up scrawny and very ugly and lean. I'd never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. And the lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They still looked just as ugly as before. And then I woke up. Now notice Pharaoh's giving more details now than he did before about his dream. And he's got some opinions. He's got some feelings about these cows that were in his dream all of a sudden. In verse 22, he reiterates the other dream that he had. He says, in my dreams also I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. And after them 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, now watch, what I would have thought before just coming right off the cuff and explaining something, if it wasn't the Holy Spirit speaking, if it wasn't God saying something about it, I would have said, Pharaoh, let me go think about this. I'll come back in 24 hours and give you my answer. Let me ponder this a while. My goodness, you're going to give answer to the leader of the world's superpower right off the cuff in his presence the first time you hear the dream. That's what Joseph did. Watch what he does in verse 25. The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, as so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. Notice, Joseph is giving God complete control over the weather. No, it's not an accident. It's not something that's just going to happen. It's something God is going to do. He says in verse 29, 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason that the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food and all the good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Wow, this guy that's been in jail all this time not only has the ability to interpret dreams, but he's got the answer. Seems like he's got a plan. He's better than all the politicians that are sitting at Pharaoh's right hand. And he comes up with it instantly and in Pharaoh's presence the very first time he stands before him. And verse 37 says that the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Immediately, Pharaoh recognized something about Joseph. In fact, he'd been in jail, had nothing to do with it. He could tell, he could discern that God was with this man. So then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God's made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You should be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow, how quickly things can change. From dungeon to a declaration of power and principle and place in the kingdom that's second only to Pharaoh. Oh my goodness. Just as things can go sour very quickly, they can go bad very quickly. And it seems like the darkness is covering the land. It looks like things are going to go so bad that there is no hope, and we get caught up in the hopelessness. God can just as quickly turn things around and change them. Doesn't mean the work is over. Because, see, for the next 14 years, there's going to be an awful lot of work to do in Egypt. God's still in the business, though, of handling things. And now he's got his man in place. And something marvelous is going to take place. It's going to be a deliverance of all the people. Keep in mind, not just the Hebrew people that God's concerned with as his elect group through whom the Messiah is coming, but the very people of the superpower Egypt. We'll see more about that tomorrow. But right now, I want you to understand just how important it is to recognize God's sovereignty over this entire situation. It seemed like things were out of control in Joseph's life, but he kept his eyes on the Lord. He allowed God to create in him a heart that could be used, a heart that was not caught up in bitterness and resentment. I look at people today coming into power in our own government who seem to be angry that they've won, ready to be vindictive and attack anybody that has an opinion other than their own. This can only spell bad news for any country. But yet here's Joseph, one who could have, by getting into power, then sought to go after everybody that had wronged him in the past. Instead, he's a man after God's own heart, and he allows God to use him to bless everybody. Wow, what a great leader. Don't we need some Josephs to stand up today? That's enough for now. Let's tomorrow see what God did through this fantastic man who was willing to go through all the brokenness to get to the blessings. I'll see you again tomorrow, right here, as we wake up in the Word.